Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics! Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. It's been a long journey. We've lost some friends along the way, met the faces of evil incarnate, and have seen the light combat the darkness. Well, strap into those comfy seats by your campfires yet again for one of the final journeys to the lake as you know it, Doughboy420's Locust Lake. Something woeful.
Shiloh, Makenzie, Seth, and Jack were running through the thick of the woods, mud-soaked ground underfoot as torrential rain came down from above. Jack huffed along, holding his arm where the redcoat had taken out a sizable chunk of flesh, yelling that the thing had bit him, that he couldn't believe that thing had bit him. He asked if he was going to get rabies or something, or if he was going to turn into a zombie.
Just keep pressure on it. We'll get you out of here.
Makenzie reassured Jack.
How can you be so calm?
Jack asked, because he was clearly freaking out.
You should be more worried about yourself right now.
Makenzie replied.
I'm worried. I'm very worried. I'm just concerned why you aren't.
Jack said.
Makenzie, Seth, why are you here?
Shiloh asked the brother and sister, which got a disgusted sigh out of the young girl.
I told you to research, not to throw a damn party in the forest and bring a buffet for this place to feast on. What the hell were you thinking?
Shiloh said, unable to hold in her disappointment and anger any longer.
We tried to stop them, but we couldn't talk them out of it.
Seth said.
But then we figured that maybe we could kill these things ourselves.
He answered.
You let them come here. You put them and yourselves in danger. You came in unprepared and you used your real names? Haven't I taught you anything? Were you not listening to anything I told you?
Shiloh scolded them.
What the hell's going on?
Jack asked, even more confused, but he was entirely ignored.
I'm sorry, okay? What more do you want from me?
Makenzie replied.
I want you to stop trying to fight things you aren't prepared to fight. I've fought these things for years and I haven't found a way to kill them. What makes you think you could?
Shiloh demanded.
We aren't helpless, Mom. You know that. When Seth found that guy's note on your doorstep, we knew that this was our chance. We took it.
Makenzie argued.
Wait, Mom?
Jack asked, but again, he was ignored.
The guy's been studying this place for a long time, it sounds like. I really think that with the combined knowledge of Todd Jacobs and the Cult of Locust, there was probably a wealth of information about the curse and how to stop it.
Seth added to the conversation.
You disobeyed me and put yourselves in danger.
Shiloh argued with her children.
We aren't kids anymore, Mom. We can do this. I know it.
Makenzie reassured her mother.
You better hope so, because if the things here don't kill you too, I might.
Shiloh angrily scolded her son and daughter.
But I've known you for 2 weeks. Why didn't you stop us from coming here?
Jack asked.
We did. Several times. None of you listened. Same lines as always. It's just a legend, or you don't really believe that stuff, do you? We hear that stuff a lot. It comes with the job.
Seth finally acknowledged Jack, talking to him as Makenzie argued with her mother.
Job? What job?
Jack asked.
Well, after our mom's run-ins with this place, she started hunting things to prepare herself to come back here. But the thing is, no matter how much she did, she was never prepared enough to come back here. Makenzie thought that she was scared, but...
Seth answered him kind of quietly, so that the two arguing women would not hear what he was saying.
Hunting things? What kind of things?
Jack interrupted.
Things that if you knew about them, they would keep you up at night.
Seth answered bluntly.
Whoa.
More than you know.
Seth replied.
Oh, shit.
Jack sighed with a shock of what he was just told. The rain poured down upon them as they made their way through the forest and up the mountain. Shiloh and Makenzie were still mumbling argumentatives back and forth as Seth and Jack walked behind them. Suddenly, the four of them were interrupted by the sound of twigs snapping in the darkness behind them. Quickly they stopped to prepare themselves for an attack, Shiloh moving between her children and the source of the sound, aiming her gun forward, ready to fire at a moment's notice.
"Don't shoot!"
A woman yelled.
"Don't shoot!"
she said as she caught up with the rest of them. It was Lillian, drenched with rainwater, her makeup running down her cheeks.
Good to see someone else made it out of there,
Seth said.
"Yeah, barely."
Lillian grumbled.
What about Cole and Gunner?
Seth asked.
"I don't know."
Lillian sighed.
We have to go back.
Seth said, stopping in the thick mud.
We have to get out of here.
Shiloh demanded.
No! We have to see if they are alright.
Shiloh was afraid of what could happen at this place. She had taken every precaution to protect her children, but now they had to put themselves in harm's way. She was terrified that it wasn't enough, but inside, she knew that she had raised them well and trained them to be strong, and that she also taught them to be good people. She knew her children were right, and they couldn't leave them behind.
You're right.
Shiloh sighed.
You keep going. I'll go back for them.
She suggested, getting a little pushback from her children who insisted that they all go together. But Shiloh felt that her children needed to get out of there as fast as possible, and that they had to get Jack and Lillian out of there safely. The siblings agreed that in this instance their mother was right. They weren't prepared for this, and they had to get the others away from this curse. So, they split away from each other. The group of four headed further up the mountain, while Shiloh made her way back through the forest, while rain poured down and thunder cracked overhead. As Shiloh passed through the trees, she began to get an eerie feeling as if she was being watched. And sure enough, that was the case. Once again, Dr. Clarke lunged out of the darkness at Shiloh, but something stopped her advance, mere inches from her target, giving Shiloh enough time to pull out a knife carved from bone, which she then lodged deep into Dr. Clarke's chest, causing her to screech in pain before bursting into a cloud of black mist. A mist that stunk of iron and sulfur, which burned Shiloh's nose and caused her to gag. It was like the smell of thick, stale blood and rotten eggs. Shiloh returned the blade to its sheath on her belt before continuing on as if nothing was a problem. She knew how to deal with the monsters here, albeit temporarily. When Shiloh finally made it to the old mansion, she found it empty. That is, aside from the hollow, flattened husk of a humanoid creature. The very same creature that had attacked them previously. A scorched and melted hole burned through its chest, revealing what was left of the hollow cavity inside. It was dead. One of the monsters of Locust Lake was actually dead. Shiloh couldn't believe her eyes.
He wasn't lying.
Shiloh spoke out loud to herself in shock and amazement, a smile upon her face and a newly energized pep in her step. Meanwhile, Cole and Gunner had made their way back down the hill and had found themselves back at the abandoned Camp of Forest Trails State Park at Locust Lake. And it was there that the visitor invited by Gunner Walden finally arrived. The two of them stopped at the entrance to the park, where they saw the approaching headlights of an old four-door Ford. Somehow he had made it through the thick mud of the rain, and now that he was allowed to pass by the lady's floodwaters, he too was stuck here. "I'm sorry, Polly. You shouldn't have come here," Gunner said.
"It's happening again, isn't it?"
The younger man with blue eyes and short, raggedy blonde hair asked. Yeah, there's been a lot of death already, Gunner said woefully.
We need to stop them before it goes any further,
Paulie said, stating that he knew his dad and the others were planning something bigger.
What do you mean?
Cole interjected into the conversation. I'm sorry, Gunner apologized. This is Paulie Croup, the son of Edward Croup. He introduced them. Paulie stopped for a moment before finishing his thought.
My dad was a member of the Cult of Locusts. He was their lawyer, so he was a ranking member. I never knew anything about it. That is, until he was killed and exposed for his participation in everything he did,
he informed Cole.
Oh, damn. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Cole began.
It's alright, my dad wasn't the best guy.
Paulie interrupted Cole's apology. It was at that moment that a small tree, broken off at a point, was thrown from the darkness of the forest like a massive wooden harpoon that became deeply embedded into the hood of Paulie's car, completely destroying any hope of using it to make an escape. And before any of them could further react, Casper Stoical was upon them. He lumbered out of the forest and grabbed a hold of Cole as he attempted to flee. Paulie managed to scramble out of his car, and Gunner attempted to attack Casper, but was easily thrown away, allowing Casper to raise a screaming Cole Kaiser up into the air before slamming his body back down onto the opposite end of the broken tree that now protruded from the car's engine, pushing a giant hole from back to front through his midsection, bringing bits of stomach and intestine out with it. Casper pushed the gasping man all the way down until he slammed against the hood of the car, several feet of bloody tree bark extended out of his midsection. Suddenly, gunshots rang out as bullets ripped through Casper. Thick, black, coagulated blood shot out from the exit wounds of the bullets, and the butcher dropped to the ground after taking several hits.
Come on!
Shiloh yelled.
We gotta go. He's not gonna stay down for long.
She added, rushing the two men along. The three of them ran toward the camp. They needed as much distance between them and Casper as they could get, and going straight through the thick of it was the quickest way to make their escape. The sound of screeching crickets and croaking toads became louder and louder as they approached the lake. Then, as they neared the cabins, everything fell completely silent. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Not even the sound of the wind could be heard blowing through the trees. Everything just stopped. This was when Paulie was attacked. A small figure dropped from a tree overhead and landed hard upon Paulie with a loud thud. This was followed by the small wooden marionette stabbing Paulie repeatedly in the face. The man's father once held a position along Mr. Shaw's side, but he held no obligation toward him for a person that betrayed his father and the cult that provided for him. Mr. Shaw mauled the man's face as he screamed in pain, his cheek being violently cut open by the small wooden man. Shiloh ripped the marionette from Paulie's face and tossed it as far away as she could, where she watched the doll-like man scurry into the darkness of the forest with unnatural, jerking movements. Paulie stumbled to his feet, a look of absolute shock upon his face. He knew who had just attacked him, and it struck his heart with fear. It was Amadeus Shaw seeking vengeance for Paulie's father against the rebel son. Paulie didn't have time to fully process the attack when everyone was startled by the sound of screaming for help from one of the cabins off in the woods. "That sounds like Lillian," Gunner spoke up, causing Shiloh to immediately charge towards the source of the screams. Gunner and Paulie followed quickly after her. Shiloh burst through the cabin door, gun in hand, to find the place lit by an oil lamp. And off to the side of the table where the lamp sat were 4 people, all tightly tied to chairs. Jack and Shiloh's 2 children were unconscious, and Lillian was panicking, struggling against her bonds.
What happened?
Shiloh asked as she ran to help them, untying Lillian first, then moving to remove the bonds from her daughter. Then, without any warning, Lillian grabbed Shiloh by the hair and yanked her backwards, allowing her to wrap one arm tightly around her neck and the other to hold a knife right next to her eye, threatening to stab through it at any moment.
What? What the hell is this?
Shiloh asked, completely in shock.
We need you, but we don't need you live. So play along.
Lillian said.
What? What are you talking about? Why?
Shiloh choked out with the arm around her neck.
What's happening?
Makenzie began to regain consciousness.
We're going to achieve our goal. He will emerge.
Lillian growled into Shiloh's ear.
Mom? Let my mom go!
Makenzie yelled.
Don't worry, Kenzie. It's all right.
Shiloh assured her daughter.
Alexia?
Paulie said as he entered through the door, completely confused.
Polly.
Lillian answered.
Who are you?
Shiloh asked, realizing in that moment that Lillian was not Lillian at all.
Alexia Shaw, the first daughter of the Cult of Locusts.
Paulie answered, staring the girl down. Her father was the source of his own father's downfall.
Why, Alexia? You had an out. You could have moved on from this.
Paulie tried to reason with her.
I helped my dad kill people. Now he is a goddamned doll. And I can't even touch him. I can't even get too close to him because of this thing.
Alexia explained, holding her sleeve up to show the cultist tattoo that she had received, the symbol of a spot over a thick black line to show the transition of good to evil, two sides of the same coin. The tattoo that contained the bones of the daughter, bones that had been ground into dust in order to be mixed with the ink of the tattoo, to permanently protect her from the evils of the lake, and also to permanently prevent her from ever holding her father in her arms again.
I had to carry him in here in a wooden box. Do you know how difficult that is?
She added angeredly.
We are going to finish what we started. And you are going to help us.
Alexia said, pressing the knife into Shiloh's cheek, just enough to draw the slightest trickle of blood.
What happened to the real Lillian?
Shiloh questioned.
Oh, I don't know. She just disappeared. Maybe she lived happily ever after. Who knows? What I do know is, it's time to finish what we started.
Alexia slid the knife across Shiloh's face, creating a shallow cut beneath her eye.
Mom!
Makenzie yelled, stirring the other two captives awake and drawing the attention of a tall monster in a wooden mask who entered through the side door before stopping beside Shiloh and Alexia. He then turned to face Paulie. The young man's eyes widened and he attempted to flee, but was quickly snatched up by the hands of the monster Jacob Treagle. Paulie kicked and screamed as he was lifted off the floor with both of Jacob's hands around his neck. Paulie gasped for air and punched at Jacob's crumbling wooden mask, knocking bits of its edges away, but the struggling soon stopped when Jacob dug his fingertips into Paulie's neck, piercing through his skin to crush the bone inside. Blood gushing out from around Jacob's fingers while he stared into the man's eyes as he slowly left him, and when he finally fell limp, Jacob dropped him to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Paulie simply crumbled and folded onto the floor. During the commotion, Gunnar was able to slip in through the same door through which Jacob had entered, and had used the distraction as a means to cut away the ropes that held the three remaining captives. After being freed, Makenzie grabbed the knife from Gunnar and turned to bury it in Alexia's side, which caused her to immediately release Shiloh from her grasp. Shiloh quickly retreated to her children's side as Alexia stumbled backward into the chair that she had been previously sitting in. She held her side and gasped for air as she collapsed into the seat, which toppled over, causing her to fall onto the floor, still clutching her side and gasping for air as blood began to trickle from the corner of her mouth. The 3 remaining survivors took this opportunity to run away from the cabin as quickly as possible, Jacob in pursuit of them soon after, leaving Alexia to slowly die on the floor. But she would not die alone. Alexia was joined by her father. He didn't care about the legacy of changing the world forever if he did not have someone to inherit that legacy. The small, wooden man crawled up close to his daughter's body, and he held her as she slipped away. His wooden flesh beginning to singe and turn black, smoke slowly escaping the cracks in the wood of his body, before turning into bellowing fumes, and then, finally, engulfing flames. The marionette began to burn in his daughter's arms, and together, the 2 of them cremated each other, burning to ashes and taking the cabin along with them, setting the old, rotten building ablaze, the canopy of the trees stopping just enough of the rain to allow the fire to rage on. The group of them ran further into the forest in order to escape the monster of the Black Woods, Jacob Treagle. The path was long overgrown. Waist-high grass covered the area where the road up the mountain once was, and eventually they couldn't tell the difference between what was forest underbrush and what was the path to take. Large thickets of blackberries covered a portion of the area to make their way further impassable. Eventually, they found themselves in a bit of a clearing where Shiloh stopped for a moment. She could barely make out the familiar sight of 2 small mounds where something had been buried in the earth.
Hey, why are we stopping here?
Jack asked, wanting to get as far away from this place as quickly as possible.
I recognize this place. Just hold on,
Shiloh said quietly. The sound of snapping twigs and breaking tree branches could be heard approaching the group from where they had come. Then just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped once again, falling silent just outside the view of the circular clearing where they all stood. They all stared at the area where the noise had originated, expecting to see a lumbering beast emerge to attack them. But it did not come. Not the way they expected it to. Instead, the tall man in the crumbling wooden mask emerged from the darkness behind Jack, where he grabbed the poor boy and raised him off his feet, very much like the way he did with Polly.
Help!
Jack yelled out as he held onto the arms around his throat. Seth attempted to charge Jacob, but was easily swatted away like a pesky fly, sending him falling backwards onto the ground. Jacob quickly withdrew his hand upon instinctual reaction to once again return it to the other around Jack's neck. While the rest of them panicked and made fruitless efforts to free Jack from Jacob's grasp, Shiloh dropped to the ground and began digging in the dirt, desperately shoveling the soil away with her hands, clawing away rocks in order to reach what was buried there. Jacob notably changed after catching what Shiloh was doing. He seemed confused for a moment, and then dropped Jack to the ground with a splat in the mud, where the young man held his neck and gasped for air, choking and coughing. Jacob then approached Shiloh in what looked like a storming fit of rage. He then grabbed the aging woman by the hair and ripped her backwards up off the ground, holding her aloft by her scalp. Shiloh spun around and stabbed something downward into Jacob's chest, between his shoulder and his neck. It was an old bone, small bits of long, necrotic flesh still clinging to it, but most of it had been picked clean by the creatures in the soil. Jacob simply looked at Shiloh for a moment, appearing to be confused, before he also dropped her to the ground. He then stumbled backwards for a moment and looked down at the bone protruding from him before his hands started gripping at the area around the old bone, clawing at his own flesh as he was trying to get something inside of him out. Jacob tore the wooden mask from his burned, decaying face to reveal that his skin was slipping off beneath it. Jacob's skin appeared to melt away from the bone beneath before slopping onto the soil with a wet splat sound. His skull, with a hanging open mouth, soon became exposed as the flesh oozed away. All of the skin across Jacob's body melted into a slop upon the ground, his organs spilling out from the freshly made holes, where they too began to sizzle and melt into a thick puddle of goo. Then, from within the hollow husk of a skull, erupted a screeching and booming sound as a burning fire burst out from the eye sockets like a raging inferno inside of him. This was followed by his ribcage exploding outward as the burning within him forced its way out of his heart. The husk of a monster burned away from the inside out as the group of them stood and watched in awe of what had taken place.
Whoa! How did you do that?
Jack asked.
I stabbed him with one of his parents' bones.
Shiloh replied, kind of in shock of what she had just done.
Wow, Mom. You're a total badass,
Makenzie said, also in shock. I told you there were a way to kill the things here. Gunnar gave her an I told you so remark, but I gotta say, that was pretty impressive.
Thanks,
Shiloh said, with a bit of a smile.
By my count, that's 3.
Seth said as he climbed up off the ground, doing his best to wipe as much of the mud off of himself as he could in the process.
So what about the others?
He then asked.
That still leaves Casper and that bitch Dr. Clarke.
Shiloh spoke up.
Mom!
Makenzie said in shock of hearing her mother talk like that.
What does your research say about them?
Shiloh asked Gunnar, finally willing to listen. Well, let's get out of this rain and I'll show you, Gunnar said as he flashed her a smile and began walking back a little ways toward an old cabin that they had seen along the trail. Like I said, this journal was written by Todd Jacobs before he was executed for murders that he didn't commit, Gunnar said as he opened the ragged, old book. Seth found an oil lamp hanging on the wall and some matches to light it in a drawer nearby. He lit the lantern and carried it over to where they were all huddled around a wooden table to read the contents of the journal. According to this book and the various papers I got from Polly from the Cult of Locusts, each of the monsters here is a representation of sin. Kind of like each of the 7 deadly sins given life. This led me to believe that some corruption of the sin's opposite, its virtue, is the means to kill the manifestation of sin, Gunnar explained.
English, please.
Makenzie spoke up.
So, the sin's opposite is what kills it?
Seth said. Yeah, but it's not that simple. It appears that there's also some variation of the dead or the corruption of virtue in each death. It's not as simple as feed the glutton, Gunnar began. I stuffed a bone from Akenifty Oniga's daughter down that monster's throat, and it killed it. I literally fed the glutton. Mr. Shaw gave away his dream to be with his daughter. His greed gave way to charity. And Jacob was killed with the bones of his parents. One could say that his rage was satiated by the love of his family. He continued.
You found all this out yourself?
Shiloh asked. Well, I followed the clues and took a chance that paid off, Gunnar said.
That's pretty impressive yourself,
Shiloh said with a smile, bringing an eye roll from her daughter.
So wait, you're saying we just have to find their opposite and kill them with it?
Jack spoke up.
Easier said than done,
Makenzie added. Exactly, Gunnar replied. We have to find the virtue for each sin, and then figure out how to corrupt and exploit it to kill them, he explained.
So, the sin's opposite is...
Seth spoke up. Envy and pride. Casper stoical, and Dr. Clarke. Gunnar said.
So, we just have to be nice to Casper and convince Dr. Clarke that she isn't hot shit. Great. That's easy.
Makenzie said with sarcasm.
Did Casper have family? That worked on Jacob, right? Maybe it could work on him.
Jack reasoned.
He was an orphan, and the orphanage burned down. He didn't have any family.
Shiloh answered. That's true, but... Gunnar replied with a flicker of inspiration in his eye before pausing for a moment to recall something. When the children died, they would bury them close to the orphanage. Maybe they buried the sisters that ran the orphanage there, too. Gunnar suggested.
What are you saying?
Makenzie asked him. He was left at the orphanage as a child. He never had any family, and he was envious of that. He was given a last name, though. The head nun of the orphanage was named Catherine Stoical. She was the closest thing to a mother that he ever had. Maybe that really could work. Gunnar answered.
So we have to find an orphanage that burnt down, find a specific grave, and dig up bones, a nun's bones, to use them to kill a giant dude in a mask, at which point he will probably melt or burst into flames or something like the last guy. Just to clarify, just so we're all on the same page.
Jack said, completely flabbergasted at what they were suggesting.
I know where the orphanage was.
Shiloh spoke up.
It's not far.
She added.
So I guess we're doing this.
Jack said with a sigh.
We should probably grab shovels or something to dig up this nun, right?
He suggested mockingly.
You're right. We're gonna need whatever we can get.
Seth agreed, before grabbing a shovel from the rack of tools beside the door of the cabin. There was a second shovel there that was retrieved by Gunnar, while Makenzie grabbed a large plastic bucket. The group of them slowly made their way out of the cabin, making sure that no one was around before hurrying along down the path and through the forest until they came across the area where Shiloh believed the orphanage once was. It was Jack that had found the old foundation when he nearly tripped over it in the thick grass. Grass had grown and coiled over the old, blackened stone. From there, they searched all around the large foundation until one of them came across some stones lying on the ground. The stones were very old and were covered with overgrowth and age, but each of them had something carved into them to show that they were some kind of marker. They weren't gravestones. They were simply fairly large rocks with carvings on them. But they were grave markers. They were in the orphanage graveyard, standing over the graves of over a dozen children, but the stones were so worn that the names on them could not clearly be deciphered.
Which one do you think is hers?
Makenzie asked as she looked around the area, now overgrown by forestry.
That one,
Shiloh said, pointing off into the forest where there were 3 legitimate headstones. Each of them had crudely shaped crosses carved into the small, curved stone. The names were worn away, but there was one stone that appeared differently from the other 2. The gravestone at the center appeared to be defaced. The cross upon it was very clearly scratched away.
Guess we better get digging,
Jack joked. Unfortunately, everyone would have to take turns digging up the earth with the limited tools that they had, using their shirts as pouches and the bucket that Makenzie had brought to haul dirt out of the hole. They dug as quickly as possible and hoped that they'd be able to unearth the casket before they were met by the remaining beasts that lurked in the darkness. For quite some time, the bunch of them cleared out dirt from the hole. Surprisingly, they were able to clear several feet of earth in a very short span of time. digging away the soil as the others rested and watched for any approaching attackers. They were a long way down, and were starting to question if there was anyone even buried there, and if so, was it really the woman they were looking for? Suddenly, all digging was halted when they heard the sound of a tree branch snapping off in the woods.
Shit!
Jack said, as he and Gunnar were down in the grave. "Keep digging, hurry!" Gunnar urged him. There was little more warning before Casper emerged from the forest. He was enraged by the presence of the men in the grave of the woman that was like a mother to him, and began immediately advancing toward them. Both Makenzie and Seth attempted to stop Casper, but he simply swatted them away before quickly moving past them. Shiloh even drew her gun and shot him several times, hitting him both in the side and in the back as he moved by her. It did not affect him very much, and he continued on to the grave, where he ripped Gunnar out of the hole and tossed him several feet away, as if he were a near weightless rag doll. This was followed by Casper reaching down into the grave to rip Jack out as well. He then tossed Jack violently onto another gravestone with a loud cracking sound as his ribs snapped against the edges of the stone. He screamed out in pain, and Shiloh did her best to help him, but she was tossed away violently as well, where she slammed against the edge of the grave and then fell down into it, knocking the wind entirely out of her. Casper returned his attention to Jack and advanced upon him when he lifted the headstone up off the ground over his head to be then driven down into Jack's skull, smashing his head like a pumpkin on Devil's Night, spreading gray matter and bits of skull flying in every direction. Casper then turned back to the grave of the only family he'd ever known and advanced forward to end Shiloh once and for all. He reached down into the hole with one massive arm and grabbed for Shiloh, but was met with a sharp bit of broken off bone that was driven deep, nearly dead center, into his chest. A gurgling scream escaped Casper's lungs before putrid liquids began bubbling up from inside of him. Casper gripped his mask and removed it from his head before grabbing at his chest and toppling over into the grave next to Shiloh. He appeared as if he were gasping for air to fill lungs that no longer functioned. The putrid, black liquid bubbled up from his mouth, choking him as he spit it out. Streams of snot and putrefied liquid spilled out of his nose as the liquids forced their way out of his body. The oil-like fluid even began to pool in his empty eye socket before spilling out over his cheek. The tumors in his head began to swell and ooze the same disgusting liquid. His skin boiled and melted off the bone in a similar fashion to Jacob before Shiloh began to hear a rumbling from within Casper's core, like the sound of a stomach tearing itself apart with a thunderous gurgling noise. Shiloh scrambled to get out of the grave, but she was unable to escape before the rumbling grew louder, and then finally, Casper burst like a mosquito filled with too much blood, his body popping like a massive zit, sending decayed chunks of disgusting matter all over Shiloh, the grave, and everything directly around it. The smell was the most rancid and disgusting thing that had ever filled the nostrils of anyone present, and it caused them to become immediately ill, which brought about a chain reaction of vomiting, adding to the disgusting array littering the small cemetery. Shiloh was finally able to climb up out of the grave after catching her breath, slipping a little bit in entrails on the way, but managed to climb up and onto her feet, where she just started laughing and pointing down into the grave at what was left of Casper's corpse.
Are you okay?
Makenzie asked her mother. Shiloh simply laughed until she drew herself to tears from laughter.
Hello? You still in there?
Makenzie asked further.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine.
Shiloh managed to spit out between laughs.
I've spent my entire life in fear of that guy, and now he's dead, and I killed him,
Shiloh said, before erupting into another fit of joyous laughter. She couldn't believe it was finally done. That Casper was finally dead. Gunnar looked at her with a smile and joined in the laughter and joy of the moment. Seth and Makenzie simply looked at the both of them with confusion and shrugged. The rain had finally let up, and the darkness was just making way for the first early morning signs of sunlight. Shiloh had managed to collect her emotions after the victory over her greatest fear, and she was riding the high of succeeding in the quest of her life as she walked down the overgrown trail from where they had originally come, back toward the camp. There was no more running. It was time to fight.
I'm sorry I doubted you. Without you, I would have been left in fear of this place forever. But now I feel so liberated. Like a 60-year weight has been lifted off of my shoulders. Thank you.
Shiloh thanked Gunnar, putting an arm around him to give him a pat on the back and a little bit of a hug. Don't thank me yet. We've still got one left to go, Gunnar replied to her.
We can do it. The rest of them are gone. We can take this one down too.
Seth encouraged the rest of them.
Yeah, we can do this.
Makenzie urged them. As the group of them neared the lake, the sound of chirping crickets gave way to an odd silence. It was like the calm before the storm. The lake began to bubble and swirl around within itself, the water churning like the angry ocean. The silence was broken by a chirping so loud that it was like a screeching as thousands of locusts swarmed up from the ground, digging themselves free in a frenzy to eat everything in sight, including each other. The locusts filled the air like a living cloud, which acted more like a churning wave of water. They swarmed around the 4 remaining members, who swatted at the attacking insects. Bugs screeched and bit at anything they touched, attempting to devour everything in sight. The cloud of insects was so thick that the group lost each other, as if they were in a sandstorm. The 4 of them could see glimpses of the gurgling lake between small clearings within the cloud of raging insects. They saw a figure emerging from the water, a woman covered in mud and ragged animal furs. Her skin was pale, a cold bluish hue, which contrasted against the red, glowing eyes, like a scarlet reflection of light in darkness, like the eyes of a cat in the night. A darker, red-hued liquid began to flow from the corners of her eyes as she wept, but it wasn't like a weeping of sorrow. It was deeper than that, a mix of suffering beyond imagination and a rage that burned up from the depths of hell. The sounds of her cries were horrendous, a wailing that could haunt the souls of even the strongest individuals for the rest of their days. The group of them fought their way through the thick cloud of locusts that blocked their path. It was as if they were making their way through the underbrush of a jungle. Locusts, like jungle vines, held them back from their goal, pushing against them like hurricane-force winds. Then, in all the chaos, Shiloh stopped for a moment, hearing the familiar voice that had haunted her nightmares for decades.
Oh, Shiloh, you've got to learn to laugh about death.
An ethereal voice said with a giggle. Shiloh turned to see the mad doctor with her decaying jaw ripped half off of her face, just dangling there, barely attached to the other side. Her voice emanated from her throat, but her mouth could no longer form words to make the sound of speech.
This is really a grave affair,
Dr. Clarke joked.
I'm done with you, Dr. Clarke. It's time you made like a tree and leave,
Shiloh said, causing her daughter to give her a weird look, even amongst the chaos, as if to say,
Really, Mom? That was so lame.
Along with an eye roll. Then Shiloh reached for the shotgun at her back and took aim at Dr. Clarke as she charged forward. Shiloh fired and Dr. Clarke disappeared into a black mist. Shiloh then turned her shotgun on the locusts that swarmed around them and began firing blasts and reloading before firing again, attempting to clear out as much of them as possible. But she was attacked from the side and driven down the hill toward the lake. Dr. Clarke charged at Shiloh and knocked her to the ground, where the two of them began rolling head over heels down the hill toward the raging water, still fighting and clawing each other the entire way down before they dropped into the lake. Shiloh immediately felt as though the lake was boiling and her skin was burning, but then she realized it was not the cold of the gurgling lake that was burning her. It was the contact of Dr. Clarke against her skin. Shiloh had prepared for her return to Locust Lake. Todd Jacobs wasn't the only one to study this area to an unhealthy level. She too had acquired information and a means to protect herself from the evils of Locust Lake. Years prior, she had heard of the cult of locusts and their use of ground bones being added to tattooing to form a protective barrier. The bones of the young native girl now protected Shiloh as well. She had a fitting tattoo on her right shoulder. A locust. She would use the lake against itself, and it was this tattoo that caused Dr. Clarke's skin to burn and boil, and in turn caused Shiloh's skin to sear along with it. Shiloh fought against Dr. Clarke, and it appeared as though this would be her last battle. She had sunk very deep, and the Mad Doctor had a supernatural strength that matched any of the other demons of the lake. Shiloh's skin burned, and her lungs along with it, begging for air and fighting against her, fighting to take a breath and bring the embrace of a watery death into Shiloh's lungs. And just as she fought Dr. Clarke, she also fought herself. Finally, Shiloh was able to retrieve a knife from her belt and drive it into the neck of Dr. Clarke, twisting it around as she looked into the doctor's yellowed eyes beneath the bubbling waves of Locust Lake. Shiloh was no longer afraid of the lake. She knew that she had won. She knew that the Mad Doctor before her had set her on a path of destruction, and a path that would lead to her victory. Shiloh glared into Dr. Clarke's eyes and twisted the knife once more before removing it and driving it into the side of Dr. Clarke's skull, which caused her to let go of Shiloh, who immediately began to swim toward the surface of the lake. But as she swam toward the air above, she was hit with an enormous force as the Mad Doctor beneath her burst with a wave of energy that ripped through the water and sent Shiloh rapidly toward the surface of the lake. She struggled to hold her breath for just a moment longer, but her instincts were too strong to hold back. Her brain eventually overrided itself, and she took in a deep breath of murky water. She felt her lungs convulse within her body as they were flooded with the muddy liquid, and then she saw nothing but blackness, and she let go, drifting through the endless darkness.
Well, it seems we've lost more than we've bargained for, but dry those tears. It's not over just yet. Can't wait 2 more weeks for the finale? No problem. The epic conclusion to the Locust Lake series premieres next weekend. So until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you by the lake again next Saturday.